Imagine standing in a church every Sunday, listening to a man preach about morality, about family, about the love of God. Imagine trusting that man completely because he wears a collar and speaks with the authority of faith itself. Imagine your neighbors trusting him too, bringing their own children to hear him speak, treating his word as something close to sacred. Now, imagine that same man behind closed doors murdering his own wife, then another wife, then his own children, one by one, over the course of several years. And imagine that the person helping him hide the bodies was his own daughter. This is not a work of fiction. This is the true story of Andras, Pandy, a pastor in Brussels who lived a double life so dark that when it finally came to light, it shocked an entire nation. For nearly a decade, he got away with murdering 6 members of his own family. And the reason he was never caught wasn't luck. It was silence, enforced by fear, by control, and by a daughter who was as much a victim as she was an accomplice. By the time the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just expose one man's crimes. It would raise uncomfortable questions about how easily respectability can shield monstrous behavior, and how long silence can be maintained when fear runs deep enough within a single household. A man of faith, Andras Pandy was born in Hungary and eventually settled in Brussels, Belgium, where he built a life and a reputation as a respected pastor within the local community. To the outside world, he was exactly what a pastor was supposed to be. He was devout, disciplined, and presented himself as a devoted family man presiding over a large household, carrying an air of moral authority that made people trust him almost automatically. Church members admired him and looked to him for spiritual guidance. Neighbors saw a stable, orderly, deeply religious household, the kind that seemed to embody the very values Pandy preached every week. Nobody looked twice at the man leading Sunday services with such quiet, unshakable confidence. Behind the walls of his home, however, a very different reality existed. Pandy ruled through fear. Former acquaintances and surviving family members would later describe a household built entirely on control, where Pandy dictated nearly every aspect of family life. He decided who could speak to whom, who was allowed to leave the house, and under what circumstances, and what could or could not be said to anyone outside its walls. Disobedience, no matter how small, was reliably met with punishment, and over time, that punishment shaped every relationship within the household around a single, unspoken rule: obey without question. His position as a pastor gave him far more than spiritual authority in the eyes of his congregation. It also granted him a kind of untouchable status within his own family, a status that made challenging him feel not just difficult, but almost unthinkable. Nobody questioned the man of God, even in moments when something felt deeply, unmistakably wrong. And those closest to him learned, often through painful experience, that questioning him carried real and lasting consequences. Consequences severe enough to silence even the people who loved him most. It was within this environment of control, fear, and enforced secrecy that Pandy began, over the course of the 1980s, to systematically eliminate members of his own family. He started with the women who had once been closest to him, the wives who had shared his home and his name, and continued on to children who had grown up knowing only one version of their father, a version defined entirely by fear rather than love or safety. What makes this period especially chilling in hindsight is how completely ordinary it must have appeared from the outside looking in. Sunday services continued exactly as they always had. Pandy still stood at the pulpit delivering sermons on family values, moral conduct, and the sanctity of the household. All while, behind closed doors, he was dismantling his own family through murder, one member at a time. There was no dramatic break in his public life, no visible crisis that might have raised suspicion, and no single moment where the mask he wore in public appeared to slip, even slightly. That seamlessness, that total lack of any outward sign that something was catastrophically wrong, is precisely what allowed the killings to continue, one after another, for the better part of an entire decade. hidden in plain sight behind the pulpit of a respected church. For the congregation that gathered week after week to hear him speak, Pandy represented stability in a way few community figures could. He was the person families turned to during their own hardships, the man trusted to offer guidance on marriage, parenting, and morality, all while his own household was quietly being hollowed out by disappearance after disappearance. That contrast between the trusted spiritual advisor and the man privately destroying his own family would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case once the truth finally emerged. It is this exact dynamic, a public image built on trust and moral authority, concealing a private reality built on fear and control, that allowed Pandy to operate undetected for so long. In hindsight, the warning signs existed, but within a community conditioned to respect a pastor's word without question, those signs were never given the weight they deserved, and an entire family was allowed to quietly vanish, one member at a time, without anyone outside those walls ever fully understanding what was happening until it was already far too late. The disappearances. Between 1985 and 1989, 6 members of Pandy's family vanished, one after another, over the course of just 4 years. 2 of them were his former wives. 4 of them were his own children who had grown up inside that same household under his direct control. Each disappearance was explained away with a simple, believable story. Pandy would tell relatives, neighbors, or fellow church members that a wife had left him for another life, or that a child had moved abroad, or had simply grown distant and cut off contact with the family entirely. In a household already defined by isolation and tight control, there was rarely anyone positioned to question these explanations closely enough to notice the pattern forming underneath them. Extended family lived far away and had limited contact with the household to begin with. Neighbors saw a respected, devout pastor, not a man capable of murdering his own children, and the very isolation that Pandy had spent years deliberately cultivating, keeping his family cut off from outside relationships, discouraging close friendships, and limiting contact with relatives, became the perfect camouflage for what he was actually doing. One by one, his victims disappeared from public life entirely, with barely a trace left behind to suggest anything sinister had occurred. No missing persons investigation ever gained real traction. No clear pattern was noticed, largely because each disappearance was treated in isolation as an unremarkable family matter, rather than as one part of a steadily growing body count. A pastor's word, within a devout and trusting community, was simply not something people felt entitled to challenge. If Pandy said his wife had left him to start a new life elsewhere, what made this case almost impossible to prove, even years later, was the method Pandy used to dispose of his victims' remains. He dissolved the bodies in caustic soda, a highly corrosive chemical capable of breaking down human tissue and bone over an extended period of time. This single horrifying method of disposal meant that when investigators eventually did search for physical evidence, there was almost nothing left to find. No bodies, no conclusive forensic proof of any kind. Just the chemical residue of 6 human lives, quietly erased inside the walls of a family home that, from the outside, continued to look entirely ordinary, even welcoming. For investigators, this presented an almost unprecedented challenge in criminal history. Most murder cases, even complicated ones, rely on the existence of a body or, at minimum, physical traces that can eventually be tested, analyzed, and matched to a suspect. Here, there was effectively nothing of that kind to work with. The case would ultimately have to be built not on forensic evidence recovered from a crime scene, but almost entirely on testimony, carefully reconstructed timelines, and the slow, painstaking unraveling of nearly a decade of deliberately maintained lies. Each of the 6 victims had once been an ordinary member of a Brussels household, with their own hopes, daily routines, and personal relationships. before being erased so completely that even close relatives struggled, years later, to reconstruct a clear picture of their final days. Pandy's first wife had raised children inside that home, believing, like so many others around her, that she was simply part of a strict but otherwise stable religious family. His second wife arrived into a household already shaped by years of hidden violence, entirely unaware of what had already happened to the woman who came before her. The children who were ultimately killed had grown up completely within Pandy's control, never given the chance to build outside friendships or independent relationships that might have raised an alarm the moment they suddenly disappeared. In a very real sense, the household itself had been carefully engineered over the course of many years to make disappearance simple and detection nearly impossible for anyone looking in from the outside. The daughter who knew. At the center of this case sits one of its most disturbing elements, a detail that complicates the entire story in ways that go far beyond a simple portrait of a killer and his victims. Pandy's own daughter, Agnes. Agnes had an incestuous relationship with her father, one shaped by years of sustained psychological control and manipulation that gradually blurred the line between victim and accomplice until the two became almost impossible to separate. Investigators and psychologists who later studied the case would describe Agnes as someone who had been so thoroughly dominated by her father from such a young age that resisting him or exposing what he had done felt for years like a genuine impossibility rather than simply a difficult choice. This was never a relationship built on equal footing. It was constructed deliberately and patiently over decades of conditioning in which Pandy positioned himself as both a religious authority commanding absolute obedience and the only meaningful source of stability, approval, and identity in her life. Agnes didn't just know about the murders taking place around her. She actively helped him carry them out. She assisted in disposing of the bodies of her own siblings and stepmothers, following her father's precise instructions inside the very home where these killings had taken place, moving through rooms that had once held ordinary family life and now held the aftermath of systematic murder. For nearly a decade, she carried this secret in silence, bound to her father by a complicated mixture of fear, dependency, and deeply entrenched psychological control that had been carefully built up over the course of an entire lifetime spent under his authority. She lived alongside the full knowledge of what had happened to her own family, unable or unwilling to speak out, trapped in a role that made her complicit in crimes committed against people she had once grown up alongside, people who had shared her home, her name, and her childhood. It's difficult and genuinely uncomfortable to categorize Agnes simply as a criminal accomplice, as though her involvement can be reduced to a straightforward choice made freely and without consequence. The relationship between her and her father raises deeply troubling questions about coercion, prolonged psychological control. She was, in many respects, both a participant in these events and, simultaneously, a victim of the very same man, someone who had been shaped methodically and over an entire childhood into an extension of his will rather than an independent person capable of standing apart from him, let alone resisting him outright. This dynamic is part of what makes the Pandy case so uniquely disturbing. It wasn't simply a killer working alone to hide his crimes from an unsuspecting outside world. It was a killer who had successfully, deliberately turned one of his own surviving victims into an instrument for concealing his guilt, sustaining that arrangement for years without her ever fully escaping his psychological influence, right up until the moment she finally found the strength to speak. There is a meaningful difference between someone who commits violence entirely out of their own free choice. Agnes's story sits uneasily inside that distinction. Even after the case became public, opinion remained divided over how much sympathy Agnes deserved. Some viewed her as fundamentally complicit, a grown woman who had made a conscious decision again and again over nearly 10 years to protect a killer rather than the victims she had known personally. Others viewed her far more as a product of sustained abuse herself, someone whose entire sense of right and wrong had been deliberately warped by a father who had spent her whole life training her to obey him without hesitation or question. Both perspectives carry some measure of truth, and neither fully resolves the deeper unease at the heart of her role in this story. What remains clear, regardless of where one lands on that question, is that Agnes's eventual decision to break her silence was the single act that finally exposed her father's crimes to the outside world. Whatever combination of fear, guilt, or exhaustion led her to that decision, it was the turning point that transformed an unsolved family tragedy into one of the most infamous murder cases in Belgian history. The silence breaks. For nearly a decade, the truth remained buried. 6 members of the same family had disappeared without a trace. There were no bodies, no crime scenes, and almost no physical evidence left behind. The man believed to be responsible continued living an ordinary life, hidden behind the image of a respected pastor and devoted family man. To his congregation, Andras Pandy was a trusted spiritual leader. He preached every week. He offered guidance to families. He spoke about morality, faith, and forgiveness. No one listening to his sermons could have imagined that, according to investigators, the man standing before them had spent years murdering members of his own family and carefully destroying the evidence. His secret remained hidden until 1997. That year, everything changed. After years of silence, Agnes Pandy finally walked into a police station and told investigators the story she had carried for almost 10 years. For much of her life, Agnes had lived under her father's overwhelming psychological control. According to investigators, she had been manipulated, intimidated, and isolated, making it almost impossible for her to speak out. But eventually, something inside her changed. Perhaps it was the crushing weight of guilt. Perhaps it was fear that she could become another victim. Perhaps it was the realization that the truth could no longer remain hidden. Or perhaps years of trauma had finally reached a breaking point. Whatever the reason, Agnes made the decision that would destroy the carefully constructed world her father had built. She confessed everything. She described the murders. She explained how family members had disappeared one by one. She revealed how their bodies had allegedly been dismembered and destroyed. She admitted that she had helped dispose of evidence under her father's direction, living with that burden for years. Her statement shocked investigators. Until that moment, there had been no major criminal investigation connecting the disappearances. Some relatives had simply stopped contacting family members. Others had quietly vanished from public life. Without bodies or witnesses willing to speak, there had been little to connect the disappearances into a single criminal case. Now, for the first time, police had someone willing to explain what had happened inside the Pandy household. Agnes's testimony became the foundation of the investigation. Detectives knew that her account alone would never be enough to secure a conviction. They needed evidence. The challenge was enormous. Nearly 10 years had passed since the first killings. Potential crime scenes had long since been cleaned, renovated, or altered. Any biological evidence that once existed had almost certainly disappeared. Investigators were forced to rebuild the case piece by piece. They examined financial records. They reviewed church documents. They searched property records connected to the family home. They tracked travel histories. They interviewed relatives, neighbors, church members, and former acquaintances. Every small detail mattered. Every forgotten document, every missing signature, every inconsistency helped strengthen the timeline that Agnes had described. Investigators also studied the pattern of disappearances. Viewed separately, each missing family member seemed like an isolated mystery. But when the cases were placed side by side, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every person who disappeared had one thing in common. Their lives were closely connected to Andras Pandy. One after another, members of the same household had vanished. None had ever returned. None had contacted friends or relatives again. Together, those disappearances painted a picture that investigators believed could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Still, the investigation remained incredibly difficult. Without bodies, prosecutors faced one of the greatest challenges in criminal law. They had to prove 6 murders largely without forensic evidence. That meant every detail of Agnes's testimony had to be carefully verified wherever possible. Detectives spent months comparing her statements with independent records. If she described a date, they searched for documents confirming it. If she mentioned a location, they revisited it. If she described financial activity or family movements, investigators searched for records that matched her account. Slowly, the evidence began to align. What had once appeared to be an unbelievable story became increasingly supported by facts that could be independently confirmed. The wall of silence that had protected Andras Pandy for years was beginning to collapse. The respected pastor who had hidden behind a public image of faith and respectability was now facing allegations unlike anything Belgium had ever seen. For nearly 10 years, the truth had remained hidden behind closed doors. Now, it was finally coming into the light, and the investigation into one of Europe's most disturbing family murder cases had only just begun. The trial that shocked Belgium. By the time the case reached trial in 2002, it had already become one of the most infamous criminal cases in Belgian history. The public was horrified, not just by the murders themselves, but by how long they had gone unnoticed, hidden behind the respectable image of a pastor and the disturbing silence of a daughter trapped in her father's control. Newspapers across Belgium and beyond covered the case extensively, and it became a defining, painful moment in the country's criminal history, prompting renewed public conversation about how easily institutional trust can be exploited by those who understand exactly how to wear it as a disguise. The trial exposed in painful detail the extent of Pandy's crimes, the killing of 2 former wives and 4 of his own children, the calculated destruction of their remains, and the psychological hold he maintained over Agnes that allowed the crimes to remain buried for nearly a decade. Prosecutors laid out a timeline built almost entirely from testimony, since so little physical evidence remained after nearly 10 years, and the destructive effects of the caustic soda used to dispose of the bodies. Andras Pandy was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The court recognized the sheer scale of his crimes, along with the calculated, methodical nature of both the murders and the cover-up that followed. For a man who had spent decades cultivating an image of moral authority, the verdict stripped away that image entirely, revealing him for what he truly was. Not a shepherd to his community, but a predator who had used that same trust as cover for the systematic destruction of his own family. Agnes, in exchange for her testimony and cooperation with investigators, received a significantly reduced sentence. The court appeared to acknowledge, at least in part, the complicated nature of her involvement, that her participation in these crimes could not be separated from years of psychological domination at the hands of her own father. It was an outcome that satisfied no one entirely, but one that reflected just how difficult it was to draw a clean line between victim and accomplice in a case this disturbing. The case of Andras Pandy remains one of the most disturbing family murder cases in Belgian history, not simply because of the number of victims or the horrifying method used to dispose of their remains, but because of what it reveals about the nature of control. A man used his position of religious authority to build an untouchable image in public while privately dismantling his own family, one murder at a time. And the person closest to him, his own daughter, became so deeply entangled in his control that she helped hide his crimes for years before finally finding the courage to expose him. 6 people lost their lives inside that household. Their disappearances went unquestioned for a decade, hidden behind faith, fear, and family loyalty twisted into something monstrous. The very institutions meant to protect them, family, faith, community, became, in Pandy's hands, the tools that allowed his crimes to go undetected for so long. It took one act of courage from the person who had the most to lose to finally bring the truth into the light. Agnes's decision to come forward did not erase her own role in what happened, but it was the single act that ended nearly a decade of silence and finally brought a measure of justice to 6 people who could no longer speak for themselves. The Pandy case stands today as a haunting reminder that the most dangerous secrets are often kept not by strangers, but by the people we trust the most, and that the image of respectability, whether built through faith, family, or community standing, can conceal the darkest truths for far longer than anyone would ever want to believe.